Hello, everyone. I'm Robyn Mildon. I am the CEO for the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, normally joining you from Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, but I'm over in New Zealand or Aotearoa today, doing some things here. But I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So we have people slowly joining us online. We've had an unprecedented amount of registrations for this one, over 570 registrations from over 50 countries. So it looks like there's some interest in intermediaries and the work that intermediaries do. Before I introduce our speakers, though, I just want to acknowledge this webinar series is all part of what we do in the lead up to our Evidence and Implementation Summit, which we are holding 27th, 28th, 29th of October this year in Melbourne, with our partners, the Implementation Science Health Conference Australia. So this time we've put the summit and the ISHCA meeting together, which has been terrific, really. So we have our early bird registration closing soon, and so if you are able to join us, you might save a little bit of money if you get your registrations in now. And the full program is available up on the website, our website, for anyone to have a look at. So without delaying it much more, I'm going to introduce our two fantastic speakers who, again, I'm very grateful to, because all they got was an email from me going, would you come and do this webinar, please? And then and they were brave and said yes. So I'll introduce them both. I'll introduce Kerry Albright first. So Kerry, I promised her I wouldn't read her entire bio out because it will just take too long. That's how impressive she is. Kerry Albright is a social and political scientist with over 25 years of experience in international development and evidence-informed decision-making. In September of 2022, she took up a position as Deputy Director, Principal Advisor, Evaluation with UNICEF's Evaluation Office based in New York City, where she oversees work on evaluation partnerships, evaluation synthesis, national evaluation capacity building, strategic planning, and all sorts of other really good things. And Kerry, I've known Kerry for a long time. She's one of my favorite humans, and she's just done an enormous, huge contribution to the evidence-based policy making and program design global field, and is involved in a number of international initiatives trying to forward and improve the use of good evidence synthesis and evaluation globally, which I've asked her a little bit about when I get her to start speaking. And then Isabella is a new friend to CEI and to me, which we're very grateful for. So Isabella, and I hope I don't get your name, I was trying to practice it before, Luksic. Sorry if that's terrible pronunciation. Isabella is an investor and social development leader with a strong track record in strategy, design, and implementation of social programs in Chile, with a deep commitment to addressing systematic inequalities, developing data-driven and user-centered initiatives that bridge public, private, and civil society sectors at both a national and international level. She's been the CEO of the Luksic Foundation since 2023, where she's led strategic transformation to turn it into an operating entity. She also has a lot more on this bio, but I've asked her to talk a little bit about herself and the foundation, so she can choose which parts she shares. And Isabel and I met on a Zoom call, as you do these days, and instantly the work of the foundation is very relevant to work that we all do globally, and I think it'll be interesting hearing more about that, Isabella. So I'll kick off, and I'll just say to participants, I will be watching the Q&A, and so please just put questions up as you have them. Don't wait to the end. We try and make this as interactive as possible, and the presenters don't use slides, which makes it hopefully a little bit more dynamic. But Kerry, if I can start with you, could you tell me a little bit more about your work and some of the work you're doing globally, in particular the ESIC initiative?
Sure. And hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining. And thanks, Robyn, both for inviting me, but also for the overly generous introduction. So as you heard Robyn say, I currently work for the evaluation office at UNICEF. I've worked for UNICEF for about 10 years now, previously in a research facilitation role, which essentially was an intermediary role. And most of my career has really been about that space, that intersection, I guess, between evidence generation, whether it be research, evaluation, into policy and practice, a smattering of implementation science along the way. So it's a topic that's very close to my heart. Robyn asked me to talk a little bit in the introduction, I guess, to introduce this initiative that I'm involved in at the moment called the Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure. Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative, ESIC. Which is really an exciting opportunity. It's something that's been funded by the Wellcome Trust and UK Research and Innovation. And really what it's aiming to do is quite unusual in that rather than just sort of looking at how we go around improving funding synthesis, which is an important thing in its own right, we might get onto in terms of an intermediary tool, but also really unusually to think about the plumbing or the infrastructure that underpins that, or the system, whatever sort of metaphor that it is that you want to use. So how we can get decisions to be made, whether they be by citizens, by policymakers, or any other sort of agent, to be based better on evidence. And we have been working on this for the last 6 months or so, just culminated in a conference in Cape Town, or a meeting, more like a workshop, to be honest, than a conference in Cape Town, where Robyn was there. And it really, we looked at all sorts of things, like how you strengthen demand as well as the supply of evidence, how we can get better at doing things like data sharing and reuse, safe and responsible use of AI, doing syntheses in a more innovative way, sort of new methods and processes, and sharing capacities, and things like equity, citizen engagement are really at the heart of it. And hopefully we can talk a little bit more about it later, but it's something where intermediaries are a really key part of this whole initiative, and there's a big focus.
That's great. Okay, and yeah, it would be great to talk more about how evidence synthesis is a good tool for intermediaries to use, and hear a little bit more about that. Can I just ask you to comment on one more thing, Kerry? You're a commissioner on the Global Commission on Evidence to Address Societal Challenges. Can you just tell the audience a little bit more about that, because that's interesting as well?
Sure. So that was a precursor, and in fact, ESIC kind of followed on from that in many ways. It kind of came out of COVID, realizing that that actually during COVID we had really done some quite interesting things in terms of ways of working. So the traditional things where you do a synthesis, you do a piece of research, you wait for 3 years, you get the answer, and then hopefully, if you're lucky, it influences policy. You really weren't cutting it, and we needed quick wins. We needed evidence to be drawn upon straight away. And the Global Commission on Evidence to Address Societal Challenges was started by McMaster University, brought some people around the world to really think about what is it that we could do to change the system, to make it better, to think about how we can much more carefully and systematically harness evidence to address some of the big global challenges of our time. And there was a big report that maybe if I can Google it quickly, I can put the link in the chat if people that are interested as we're chatting.
A CEI staff member that's online would happily take that task from you, Kerry. I can see a few of you. So if you Google Global Commission on Evidence to Address Societal Challenges and find the report, I would be grateful, so Kerry doesn't have to multitask. Isabella, want to hear a little bit more about you. You also won an award recognized as a World Economic Forum of Young Global Leaders in 2025 and 100 Women Leaders in 2024 in Chile. So I'm not letting that go past without hearing a little bit more about that. But tell us a little bit about your work and also the work of the foundation.
Well, thank you very much, Robyn, for having me. It's actually a great surprise to be a part of these conversations. And thank you everyone for making the time to connect tonight. I also agree with Kerry. Robyn did very generous introduction, so I'm not gonna stick to so much about me. But I think what's interesting about me being here today, or the foundation, is that I don't think we saw ourselves as evidence intermediaries explicitly until very recently. And so I think there's a bit of a road a process we've undergone that I think is kind of interesting to sort of learn from, that brought us to this table, this conversation. And so I think maybe that's what we can mainly discuss. Just to give you a bit of background on the foundation, sort of where we're coming from. This is a family foundation based in Chile, and it's been around since the late 1990s. And for the most part, it was actually a grant maker in the educational sphere, specifically around vocational high school education. But in 2019, as a family, we basically decided we wanted to change our strategy around philanthropy because we weren't seeing the results that we wanted to see. And we weren't as involved as we wanted to be with what was actually happening. So what happened is in 2020, we brought together different initiatives, and this led us into the transition from being a grant maker to an operating entity. And that is where things started shifting. So we've now been operating for about 5 years. And I think the main learning curves have been around how important it is to always keep your feet on the ground when you're thinking about solving social problems. You have to obviously fall in love with the problem and not the solution you're implementing. And so keeping that permanent check or that reality check and that connection with people is so essential to what you're doing. And so that's where I guess our role as an intermediary kind of comes about. So in recent years, since I've taken over the foundation, what we've really tried to do is sort of bring about best practices from different sectors to what's considered the social sector or philanthropy. So bringing what we know has worked for a really long time in the private sector and corporations around the work with users, user-centric design, UX, and all these different processes, as well as permanently adjusting our designs based on evidence. So that was the core of our restructure, redesign in 2020. And since then, we sort of looked to permanently merge the world of theory, evidence, and ideas with practice. And so basically that's where we're at today. So we're currently implementing a portfolio of different programs, but primarily around skills development in education at different stages of life, as well as social emotional development. So tying in the social emotional with formative skills, be they through high school, through teachers, or through professional studies further on, as well as positive parenting, which is a social emotional skills, as well as supporting teachers and entrepreneurs who are obviously family sustenance. So that's a bit of an overview of the foundation, sort of maybe might give more hints as to questions that can be asked about our role as evidence intermediaries.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Well, let's get into just discussing evidence intermediaries in general. And I've come across a lot of people that have never heard of that term before. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. It's also, I've heard groups like CEI or the foundational stuff, Kerry, that you've run. I've also heard it discussed as evidence units, and evidence facilitators, implementation science academies. So it's got a few different terms, but in general, when we're talking about intermediary agencies, it's often organizations, can be people, but it's often organizations that are focused on bridging the gap between evidence, research, and practice and policymaking by supporting others to do that. So it's that classic sort of in-between type role. So Kerry, tell me a little bit how you think of evidence intermediaries and the different types that you've seen in your time.
Sure, Robyn, and it's true. I mean, I think this is actually a real it's a real challenge in its own right for our sector, in that there are so many different terms for this sort of concept. So as you mentioned, evidence brokers, knowledge intermediaries, evidence support units, evidence networks, all of these sorts of different things. But like you, for me, they're either sort of individuals or entities that work in that in-between space between the evidence generation and the evidence users or decision makers. So they can help provide decision makers with the best available evidence, and they can support evidence producers with opportunities basically to make an impact from that evidence. And I think they're very often the sort of catalysts for change. They act as a sort of a map or a guide to the evidence, demystifying a lot of often quite technical jargon, contextualizing evidence, and appraising its quality. But it really does vary hugely from context to context. So in the UK, you have something, for example, like the What Works centers, or an equivalent sort of thing, the clearing houses in the US. In other countries, you have things like parliamentary research services or support units, for example, in the government of Uganda, which their main mandate is to respond to questions from elected members of parliament, or similar sort of embedded evidence labs who try, often based in NGOs or universities, try and respond to questions from government officials or others to produce rapid evidence syntheses in real time. There are other bodies that are, so I used to work for the Department for International Development, now Foreign Commonwealth Development Office in the UK, and we had a team called Evidence to Action, and we were basically evidence brokers that aimed to mediate between the research that was being generated through different programs to our policy and programming colleagues. So it's that in-between space, and it takes the people, as you say, the people in the organizations in there take multiple different forms. But really that the people that kind of broker between evidence generators and users.
It's terrific. Isabella, have you seen similar things in the context that you're working in, or quite different things? Because we say this all the time, but context really does matter. And as you know, CEI works in multiple countries around the world, and we certainly see differences in the way intermediaries. So just if you could comment on where you're sitting.
Yeah, I think what we've definitely seen is, from our experience, basically. So first of all, as I mentioned before, like really committing to solving a problem. So really defining, well, that problem is essential, and for that you need to do heavy lifting in terms of literature review and evidence. So cross-checking what others have already read, thought, and done about the different problems, and that we've always crossed over with on the ground sort of field work, obviously, which implies all sorts of interviews or qualitative as well as quantitative information research. And that bringing that together has really allowed us to design solutions that actually act as an intermediary. So I wouldn't say that necessarily we are an intermediary as such, but more like the solutions we've designed for specific problems act as the intermediaries. And I think that's been really interesting to discover, I think, as a conceptual, as I think both Kerry and you, Robyn, said, most people don't really know about these terms, and it's not until you like get deep into the rabbit hole you start realizing that this is what you're doing. So we actually realized this in retrospect, because quite a few of our programs basically sieve through a lot of public information, specifically for schools. I think we can focus on schools as a complex system where there's a lot of layers of information, right? And it's often very difficult to really decipher what's the latest, what is real, what is correct, and how do you connect the dots between that information? And so when we've gone into analyzing these problems, we've realized that there's huge barriers, information gaps or information barriers for end users, right? So the state produces information, or different entities offering something produce information, but it's very hard for the end user to actually decipher and map that into what they actually need. And so what we've been doing is synthesizing, as Kerry just said, so synthesizing all of this information available and making it very digestible. So a lot of our programs turn into or are paired with sort of very concrete or physical documentation that guides you step by step in terms of what you need to do, very user-friendly, very simple, so that it's kind of simplifying the user's life, i.e. the teacher or the administrative person, and rather than making it more complex. And so what we're looking at to do at the end of the day is really identify where these relevant this evidence can make relevant impact in solving basically their need or the problem. So so that's, I guess, an example of how we've seen this, and it really does stem from the crossover from the academic or the literature review, crossed over with practice, crossed over with what actually the system says. And so it's always playing with different toggles at the same time, and sort of calibrating it according to the need of the audience.
It's great. Well, that leads me nicely to ask a little bit more about what tools you've seen intermediaries use, and it also leads me a little bit to the skills that they need. But if we think about Kerry, if you can comment on what things you've seen that seems to be very important for intermediaries to use in the work that they do. And
yeah, I mean, I guess if you're talking about things like strategies, I think you really have to be a connector, and ideally someone who is sort of, it comes from sort of inter and multidisciplinary sort of contexts. You can connect across different sorts of sectors, different types of interest holders. It also involves, I'd say, having your finger on the pulse to a certain extent. So that sort of social listening stuff, whether it be online fora or in real life, but really not being psychic, but in a way being able to understand emerging issues, trends, concerns that are likely to need evidence to help as part of the solution at some point. Really being good strategic planners, so trying to think of opportunities for influence that are coming in the longer term, understanding policy windows, legislative debates in parliaments, that sort of thing, legal reforms, and being quite opportunistic at the same time. So being a good planner, but also being able to move quickly and be agile and be opportunistic as unforeseen opportunities arise. And I talked previously about synthesis, and I think that's a really important skill set or a strategy for intermediaries. So rather than just being able to promote the findings from a single study, actually having the ability to look across bodies of evidence, to present that in a sort of unbiased and objective way, seeing the bigger picture, so that you can weed out the outliers that may be just there from relying on one or two single studies, and the bias within that, which I think gives potential users more confidence in what you're sharing, and maybe sort of pointers. I mean, you can't ever sort of lift and shift something from one context to another, but maybe pointers about the sorts of things that may work with contextual adaptation. So I think all of those sorts of strategies are really important for intermediaries. I can come back to the sort of specific skills. I think if you want me to later, there's some really interesting work on that.
That was a mistake. The other things to add in terms of what tools or strategies, if you like, that Kerry's saying that you think are important or you've seen are almost sort of vital for an intermediary?
Yeah, just a compliment. I think our organization has become increasingly complex as we actually address this kind of work. And I think that's been a realization that the social work that we were used to doing kind of could operate in a more simple way, in a way, or the teams required less complexity. What's happened in recent years is that we've had to really double down on our evaluations and measurement teams on one hand. That allows us to produce a synthesis of information real time at speed, like integrating everything that's produced on an academic level with reality, and as well as carrying out all these sort of focus groups and all the qualitative on the ground information. And then I think what also happened is that as we realize the need to deliver this effectively, we've become increasingly more complex again with the need to have teams that understand what like very efficient delivery processes are. So that's a different type of skill set that social organizations, or at least philanthropic organizations, in my experience, don't necessarily have from the start. I think it's something you realize you need as you think about the end user, and when you start putting them at the center, you realize the importance of processes and sort of the fine-tuning of first interactions, last interactions, and how much you're requesting of each user, right? So the needs, I think, shift in terms of how the role evolves, right? So specifically when you're, given the conversation we're having, obviously when you're in a certain type of intermediary, maybe only with government officials or government organizations, it's probably a very different skill set to what you need when your intermediary is the end user. And so I think that's definitely something to keep in consideration, because there's very different strategies that requires. I think something that Kerry also said stands out to me, which is sort of strong relationship or trust building in a way. And that has a lot to do with sort of how do you ensure that the end user is going to really believe what you're saying as true? Why would they choose your source over a different one? And so it's also building that sort of, I guess, consistency, also rigorousness in the process, and maybe also finding external validators that sort of certify that. We found, for example, one of our programs, we have the Ministry of Education sort of validation stamp, and I think that gives certain students sort of the okay, this is legit information and that's what you want. But this could also play out the other way around, right? When you're thinking of taking information to government, you probably need to have the backing of different academics or different institutions that know what they're talking about, right? So bridging the practitioner with the opposite side permanently. So maybe that's something I would add around skill sets. I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because it depends very much on the specific objective and role one looks to accomplish.
Well, if you want to keep going with that theme, then Isabella, and pick up, because I would both of you have laid out one of the challenges for intermediaries, which is the breadth of skill that you need within any one organization, and the different backgrounds you need, and the legitimacy that you need to have in terms of people. They don't need to come to a group that sits in the middle of research, policy, practice, funding. They could do direct service delivery. They could work with the university. So just, you want to keep going with that theme around what challenges you think intermediaries have that they need to overcome to be able to be effective.
Sorry, I raised my hand. I made a mistake there.
I was like, it's okay. Go ahead.
I wasn't sure if I was going with Kerry. Do you want to go first? So
you keep going, Isabella. You're on a bit of a roll then.
Okay. So I guess I mean, we've definitely run into quite a few difficulties. So specifically, I think it's also been mentioned, like context-specific evidence, since we've always been looking at both national evidence, but also scanning what's internationally available. You do find that often similar contexts are studied more often than not, and so there is a gap when you're trying to adjust it. So I would say that's something that we definitely run into, finding evidence. We've reached out to many times that we reached out to different academics or authors of papers to sort of say, hey, you give us more insight. And actually, it's very, very hard to actually match with our current context, which is Chile. And I'm sure other people face that. And the other thing I think we've also run into is almost a lack of like granular details sometimes in theory, or when we look at papers and such, at least at the academic level, we sometimes really find gaps in terms of like, well, okay, so how did you actually do it? Like the how and the what more specifically answered, rather than the like theory behind it. And I think that's something that probably is within the role and the scope of this challenge, I think, of an intermediate actually explaining at a granular level what the what and the how requires, right? And I think that's been something that we're trying to sort of do better in as well. So we are also producing our own policy briefs and sort of very simple, as I mentioned, sort of what do you call them, like documents or like resources that you can offer to others, and sort of trying to also share with others what our experience has been around this evidence. Because we also see that as a learning curve for others, but it's definitely not, even the policy briefs that we put out sometimes that will expire or will be outdated eventually because of what you're finding, right? So it's this permanent sort of challenge to keep up with what's new. Not necessarily that it changes on a very like fast basis, but especially with technology, I think things are definitely, strategies have to change, and so the what and the how definitely changes, right? And so I think we're finding those types of issue. We haven't fully overcome all of them, but I think it's a permanent challenge to sort of be very aware of, so that you don't overlook the processes that actually are involved. And I think that's what this sort of operational outlook we've had in recent years has really led us to look at. So, okay, like what are the actual actionable actions one by one, and who does what? laid out that is very hard to sometimes interpret. And that's where we found a lot of gap between design theory and ideas, which are normally great, but to practice, there's always a huge jump you have to make in between. And so that that role is really important. And that's where I think intermediaries definitely have to step in and help with the actionable items.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Kerry, have you got some challenges to add?
Yeah, I mean, I really sort of hear what Isabella is saying, and you know, many of those resonate, I think. What else I'd say maybe is a big challenge, I guess, is of course being aware of the power and the politics around evidence use or not use, vested interests. Sometimes that can be quite explicit, and sometimes it can just be a case of institutional inertia, I guess, and not being particularly bothered about using evidence to inform decisions. And I think another challenge really is kind of at two ends of the spectrum. So there are certainly people who don't necessarily understand the value of evidence, who would either try and cherry pick or ask you to find something that that sort of matches their preconceived opinions. And you know, have other arguments around budget cost or other things that they would say would be more important necessarily than basing decisions purely on evidence. But at the other end of the spectrum, we've also got sort of evidence fanatics who maybe don't understand the limitations of evidence because of those things. Like, you can have the best piece of evidence in the world that something works, but if there's no budget to implement it, you're going to have to think of a different solution. Similarly, there are sort of moral arguments, a lot of the complex social challenges that Isabella was talking about. It's not just a question of black or white evidence. There are sort of very much sort of shades of gray in terms of where you stand on a spectrum of decision making for tackling social challenges. I mean, there's also, I mean, the classic ones, obviously mismatched timeframes. You know, that's one I sort of started off talking about at the beginning. And that can also be exacerbated, not just on the evidence generation side, but also very often on the busy schedules of decision makers. As an intermediary yourself, I think sometimes there's a challenge about being able to pitch at the right level, to understand the skills and capacities and interests of your listener, and of the listener, and kind of knowing and understanding what will resonate. Definitely what Isabella said about keeping on top of the evidence base in fast moving fields. And I mean, our main challenge, our main competitor these days is Google and ChatGPT. So trying to understand that having a human in the loop brings added benefits and nuances to contextualizing and interpreting evidence, including sort of ethical issues, human rights, security, safety, data privacy, all of those sorts of things, just for a start. And then I think a really big challenge for our sector, it's a bit meta, but is that because of there's so many sort of different terms for what we do, there's no sort of common conceptual frameworks or skills to actually measure the impact of a lot of what we do. So, you know, how do you measure whether increased trust led to benefits or building relationships led to benefits? They're all quite intangible things. So it's often quite hard to kind of immediately say, this is an impact from the thing that I did. And I mean, the big one that we haven't mentioned is the lack of funding for this space very often. So if you can't prove immediately that you're having an impact with these sorts of often quite intangible in the middle type of activities, then it's very hard to get them taken seriously.
Yeah, and I would triple agree with that. We at CEI, we are dealing with that constantly. And in fact, we're in a bit of a process right now of sort of refreshing our strategy. And we know that unless we can show what impact we're making, it is very hard to take some of the work, like show why intermediaries have a role and how they can help improve outcomes in a very particular way. So that's a hot topic of conversation for sure in most of the meetings that we're in. I am very pleased. Did you want to go, Isabella?
Yeah, I just wanted to compliment. I think that's Well, I guess everyone here, I think those of us who believe in evidence as a tool for decision making, we're assuming a certain common rationality around that, and I think that is increasingly questioned in today's context, I think. And so that's something that we, I think, have to work towards sort of reaffirming permanently the value of evidence in decision making. And maybe the way to frame that, I think, especially given all the obstacles that Kerry mentioned, which is, I agree with all of them, is bringing it always back to sort of the end goal. And I think, again, it's understanding who you're talking to, what their objective is. So be a policymaker, what is their end goal? It might be tied to both. If it's my case, working with schools, my objective is that the teacher improves math and language learning in school, right? So it has to translate directly into sort of their interests. And I think aligning incentives is very difficult, but very important for this work at the end of the day to really prosper. So I think it's a huge challenge for the sector overall, both academic, practitioner, and intermediary, the whole package of working around evidence-based decision-making interventions and such.
There are two questions that have come in related to what we're talking about right now, and I can see also some other great questions. So appreciate participants, you posting these. So I'm going to read both of them because they're related to what we're talking about. So one person has asked, Kerry spoke about having a workshop on what could be done to increase demand and supply of evidence. Are there some ideas that could be shared on the demand side? What are the corresponding problem statements? There's a follow-up to that, so just hold on to your hats. Evidence is a term that can be used in different ways by different people. This can potentially lead decision makers to be dismissive of all evidence. I'm interested in how Kerry and Isabella explain the value of their work to decision making. So I suppose the theme of both those questions is around increasing demand. And so maybe, Kerry, do you want to comment first specifically, because I know you do a lot of work in trying to improve demand side or showing the value of the work?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start there because it kind of followed on from the last comment, which is really, I mean, it relates to a question that you'd posed earlier, Robyn, about legitimacy and how we can really build legitimacy and support for our work. And I think, legitimacy isn't, it's earned. Yeah, it's not something that's granted by your very existence. So I think for me, the support for the work of intermediaries has always really come from really clear utilization benefits. The user sees the added value of the intermediary type work, and that in turn, I think, really feeds the demand process. And so we started off at the beginning talking about the evidence synthesis infrastructure collaborative, where I mentioned that demand side is a really massive piece at the heart of this, both intermediaries and demand side. And I think very often still, as a former academic, we fall into the trap of having our thing, trying to promote it, get it taken up, even if you don't need an intermediary. If you're a really sort of excellent communicator as an academic, you're still promoting your thing, and the incentives are there to promote your thing. And even the communications colleagues in your team are there to promote your research, etc. So we're kind of pushing rather than pulling from the beginning. And I think trying to flip that model and say, not these are the questions that I'm asking, and these are the answers to the questions that I've found, but actually to start with the policymakers or the practitioners in the driving seat to say, this is my problem. What sorts of diverse forms of evidence can you find to help me solve it? Whether it be implementation, whether it be evaluation, whether it be behavioral science, whether it be whatever it may be, all sorts of diverse forms of evidence. And I think, we actually have to make sure that that demand doesn't just happen automatically. I think you need to actually make people aware of the added value, the sorts of things that you can do. You need to build the skills and capacities of people to even if not to sort of undertake things like synthesis, but to understand or to interpret it. And you can help them through it as an intermediary. You can kind of explain things through evidence gap maps and really kind of nice, visually pleasing and simple tools. But getting people to understand the limitations of evidence, how to interpret evidence, all of that sort of stuff is super important. Otherwise, you are just continually pushing, and you're never going to have that sustainable system. And there are many really great examples of units and support units that have been doing that, embedded in government, embedded in parliament, etc., as I say.
Yeah, we have one of our colleagues on this webinar, Eleanor Williams, who was chairing the demand side. So she's very excited that we're discussing this. Isabella, would you like to add?
Very shortly, I think I follow up on everything Kerry's just said, and I think what we've realized is the need to build that capacity, especially in peers, but also I think, yeah, it's generating those spaces of conversation around the use of evidence that feel comfortable. I think because understanding some of this work is quite complex at times and it has a lot of different variables, there's also a role in the intermediary in trying to facilitate that and making it sort of or flattening out the learning curve, if you know what I mean, kind of making it more accessible. I think that that's very important, but from different levels. So I also think that there's an interesting opportunity for intermediary funding in a way, whereby you help build that capacity right in government or in other organizations or in grant making organizations that obviously have a different type of power. So I think it's very interesting to think about the skill sets required, and that basically feeds into the legitimacy aspect, right? Because the more people feel empowered to use that information correctly, I also think it has a positive spillover effect, right, on the decisions made, and sort of that leads to further legitimacy in a way. Obviously, there's not one feedback loop; there's multiples. But I do think that working with other entities that all understand and speak the same language, I think that's been a common thread. It's also been said in the comments that we have an issue with a common language around this, and it's a very complex language sometimes. So thinking about how to make it simple, almost to the point, not confusing, and sort of, I think maybe almost having a glossary could help it sometimes. But simplifying things, I think, definitely helps have everyone on the same page. So it's not there's not that disjoint of sort of information power, right? Information sort of disbalance or unbalance.
Yeah. We have also two related questions, and we have an idea from someone on the Q&A about how to measure impact. Most significant change methods, causality theory, can be a good way to measure impact change from intermediaries. So facilitating a workshop, stakeholders, evidence synthesizers, and evidence users to discuss and seek agreement what has and hasn't changed about the problem and what change there is agreement stakeholders have influenced and what change has occurred from external factors. That's a very interesting idea. Thank you. And I read that out loud so I can go back to it. There's two questions that are also related to each other. And it's sort of in this land of capacity building for people to understand how to use evidence. So I'll read them both. Hello, there's somebody from ID Insight online, so nice to see you. I think an interesting challenge we work on also is matching our work in evidence generation and use with the current capacities and capabilities of government partners to use that evidence. Oftentimes, capacity building efforts need to be added to ensure data and evidence can and does get used. Curious to hear your thoughts on how you address this in your work, and there's a follow-up that's also related. What are some of the ways you've seen capacity building work for evidence and users? And do you think we need to develop more training, or are there better mechanisms to do that? So I suppose that's all acknowledging that groups intermediaries work with may not be evidence ready. They may need some capacity building to pick that up. So if we can hear from both of you, your thoughts or strategies that you've seen work for that. Kerry, you can kick off.
Sure. And I just wanted to quickly pick up on the comment about the most significant change. I think that is really interesting. I've used sort of process tracing before as well to try and measure backwards. But really thinking about, what changed, and then try and map back and to see whether or not there was any contribution along the way. So kind of quite closely related, I think, to the most significant change approach as well. On the capacity sharing thing, I mean, this is a real focus as well within the ESIC report. We had a similar group that was talking about and intentionally talking about capacity sharing, because I think very often it's seen that, this is, especially with synthesis, this is something that groups based in the global north know how to do. There are a few embryonic units in the global south, and we need to build capacities of both people to conduct more syntheses, but also to use it. And that really, I mean, what came out from the ESIC process really loud and clear was that really wasn't the case. And there are so many sort of really groundbreaking evidence networks, evidence units based in the global south, from whom, people in my own country, the UK, could learn quite a bit as well. Yeah. So I think that learning from experience around the world, the contextualization of evidence matched not just with the what works, but the how and the why, the implementation, the political economy factors are really super important. So it's capacity sharing beyond just the technical, but also the social is really important. I think there's stuff around thinking about capacity sharing across the sectors. We are still quite siloed. So at the workshop in Cape Town, we had people from environmental synthesis. We had people, I mean, largely traditionally comes from the health sector. But if we're talking about an evidence system, we really need to be able to learn lessons and share capacities about what has been and hasn't been working across those different sectors, because many of the social problems that we're trying to tackle are incredibly complex, wicked problems that can't just have a single lens. Again, within ESIC, there's a lot around thinking about citizens and building the capacities of citizens to sort of challenge decisions that are made, to hold governments and others to account, but also in their everyday lives to actually think about, just the way that you would look at a kind of price comparison website to decide where to shop and buy your latest car or whatever it may be, your travel policy. We ought to be able to sort of shop around as citizens in our daily lives to use evidence. And there are some really interesting I mean, Isabella may want to talk more about this, but I think about, entities like the Education Endowment Foundation, who've produced things like teacher learning toolkits, which enable teachers to say what are the best sort of evidence packages to utilize in schools. Many other examples like that. And then there's capacities. So what I'm trying to say is it's not just capacities of building, it's not just building capacities of users to understand and interpret evidence. Capacities need to be shared and strengthened all over the place. I think even intermediaries. So again, anyone who was there in Cape Town, this organization called eBase Africa has been doing absolutely amazing work about communicating evidence in very different ways, in ways that sort of make sense for local communities and local contexts, using things like storytelling and dance, which is not something that many people who work in the evidence space feel very comfortable with at all. But they're academically trained, they understand the language of things like systematic reviews, but they're able to take the findings from that and share it in a really different way that reaches potential users and communities in a way that traditional academic communication just really wouldn't, but without losing the kernel of really important scientific messaging at the heart. Similarly, the whole sort of space of edutainment. I used to, when I was at DIFID, used to work with a lot with a company called the Media Company, who did a lot, Media Company, who did a lot of work around soap operas across Africa. Ones like Makutano Junction or Shamba Shape Up, where they inbuilt sort of messages coming out of agriculture research, nutrition, etc., into soap operas that were watched by millions and millions of people around the country. So it's that bridging the scientific messaging and getting it to your audience in an interesting way that actually resonates with their own experience.
And that actually is a nice segue, because we're getting some questions here about, in addition to policy briefs, what else can we do? Because by themselves, they might not be. But I had not heard of soap operas. Kerry, can you repeat just for one of our participants, when we were talking about measuring impact, then what was the term you used?
Tracing.
Process what?
Tracing.
Tracing. Got it.
Tracing. Tracing.
It's
So
like racing process.
no.
Okay, process tracing. There you go, participant. Isabella, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think, but building off of what Kerry's just been saying, and I guess some of the questions in terms of getting this across, I think there's so many mechanisms, but it really does require understanding who you're getting the information to, right? Because if you're going to government probably doesn't want to look at a soap opera. But if you're going to end users, I mean, we've seen that work in different places. Today, podcasts are a different thing. We've actually been experimenting a lot with different sort of like local radios and what it means sort of having that as it's a huge information mechanism in a lot of developing or developing countries, either radio or sort of like local newspapers, very specific. So it really does require understanding who's going to be and who do you want to actually understand this. And I think there's many opportunities around innovation there. And I think going back to something you said, I think it was quickly said, but we haven't really discussed, is sharing mistakes and sharing what doesn't work. It's also contextual, obviously, but I think there's a lot to be learned from mistakes, from implementation of theory. And well, we're in the process of writing our brief around what went wrong for one of our programs. We had a non-conclusive impact evaluation on an entrepreneurship program, and we're hoping to share it at the end of the year or beginning of the next. But basically, it's not that we implemented things wrong. It's just that the theory we brought together many evidence-based recommendations, and just the package didn't prove to actually target what we wanted to move. And so what does that mean? How do you rethink things? And also sort of there's a role, I think, for the social sector that isn't the state to actually innovate and sort of try things that the state can later scale. And so we have to fail. We have to take risks at some point. And there's a space there, I think, where intermediaries, or especially evidence, is essential in making informed investments, right, in these kind of pilots or initiatives that may or may not succeed. And there's a lot to be learned from those processes. Not everything will be scalable. Not everything will succeed. And I think we also really need to take into consideration that we often have many initiatives that work, but work only so circumscribed to a very specific application with a specific team that are unscalable. That's another thing to consider, I think, when we're looking at sort of solving social problems, right? So thinking around those aspects in terms of the decision making behind the use of evidence and how you're using that at different scales. I would add to.
Yeah, that's terrific. We can't escape anything when we're we cannot escape this topic. We only have 5 minutes left. You're going to guess what it is. So there's a number of questions about AI and the use of AI around evidence synthesis, and what will that mean for intermediaries? And even somebody asking, do we have any recommendations for tools that might be ready? So Kerry, again, I know this was a big topic of conversation in Cape Town, so I'll get you to comment, and then Isabella, you get the last word.
Thanks, Robyn. I mean, AI is not going anywhere. It's here to stay. ChatGPT is a valid competitor. But as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I really think that having a human in the loop is really important. So those tools are smart and savvy for doing, at the moment, quite basic things. So summaries, fantastic by and large. Doing initial sort of screening, searching, brilliant. But in terms of synthesis related to the question, the sort of interpretation, the contextualization, the analysis, the extrapolation, and the understanding of what works in one context and what might work for another, there's still a massive way to go. So I think they will help. I would, of course, going to direct you to the ESIC report, the whole working group that did this 6 months of work on what are the current AI tools. They mapped them. You can see it all there in some of the solutions from the earlier reports. I think there's a lot of potential as I say, they're not going away, but we do need to get a lot smarter about using them. I mean, but then that's the case with synthesis generally anyway. I think it's not just for AI. When we're doing syntheses, I think we need to think about tools that have worked traditionally for the research world, for primary research and impact evaluations, really don't work in my world, where I'm talking about UN evaluations that largely focus on process and performance, or the implementation, the what and the why. So there's a big space for AI to actually help us to sort of think through much more adaptable tools. I think there's a real potential around what we're trying to get to in ESIC around living synthesis. So if we're thinking about doing things faster, cheaper, better, at least with the faster, you can keep things up to date a lot more quickly rather than having to start from scratch every single time. There's big potential there, and I think it will eventually bring costs down, especially if we sort of help with doing things like data sharing and can enable sort of scraping of repositories and all of that sort of techie stuff that AI machine learning can really help us with. And I think that's quite exciting. I mean, some people see it as a threat. I think it could be really quite liberating. It could actually allow a lot of the grunt work to be done by the machine and a lot of the interpretive analysis, the networking, the human, the relationship element, which is where we know it really matters in terms of getting evidence used or taken up, to intermediaries and experts.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. Isabella, final word.
Yeah, very quickly. In complement to that, I think it's also, we know that information, the use of AI is definitely a great tool, but the questions we ask are essential, right? So it's all about asking the right questions more than necessarily the output, I think. And then we've also been really exploring the potential use it has in delivering applications. So not necessarily in the evidence creation. I think, as Kerry said, it's probably not a great idea to have them in evidence creation, but probably in synthesis may be possible. But I think it's choosing the right time to use it is essential, because there's definitely things we can't replace with AI, right? Like our implementation evaluations are all qualitative, on the ground, contrast of what we said we were going to do and what's actually happening. And so there are things that we just can't really replace. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, and not get too excited with using AI for everything. I think there's definitely a huge human component in getting these things right.
Well, thank you both. That was terrific. We're getting some really nice feedback in the Q&A saying what great speakers you both are, so I appreciate it. And you bounced off each other very nicely, so you made my job extremely easy. And thank you to all the participants that joined us, and there'll be many more that probably are asleep right now that will be watching the recording at a watch party at an office near them. But thank you both, and thank you everyone. And don't forget, if you want to register for the summit, the Evidence and Implementation Summit, with the early bird is still open, and lots more of these conversations will be had there. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.